Hello, my name is Jeffrey Nicholas. I'm an associate professor of philosophy at Providence College. This is a lecture on science fiction, the general category. If you're interested, I've already recorded a lecture on cognitive estrangement, which is Darko Suvin's understanding of science fiction. We will talk about Suvin in this lecture, but I'm going to give a broader definition of science fiction, one of my own sort of making. So welcome to this lecture. When we think about science fiction, we often get into conversations about what counts as science fiction. I had a professor in grad school once who said that Dune, one of my favorite novels, is not science fiction. And so I had to think a little bit about, well, why wouldn't it be science fiction? So here are two quotes from Dune. If you're not familiar with the book, I highly recommend it. Um, Written by Frank Herbert, it is one of the first, if not the first, science fiction novels to deal with environmental disaster. So one of the quotes from the book says, once men turned their thinking over to machines in the hope that this would set them free, but that only permitted other men with machines to enslave them. So this is about a revolution that happened. Dune is set thousands of years into the future, and the revolution was against thinking machines, what we of course would call computers. Another quote here is, deep in the human unconscious is a pervasive need for a logical universe that makes sense, but the real universe is always one step beyond logic. Here, obviously, science itself asks for a logical universe. This is an aspect of much of Western philosophy. And Frank Herbert is saying that the universe is really one step beyond logic. So for someone like Suvin, who I've already lectured about, this step beyond logic, or the idea that machines could enslave human beings, would be anti-science, and for Suvin would not count as science fiction. So that might be one reason why people would not count Dune as science fiction. But I want to look at something broader than Suvin's understanding of science fiction. So let's look at some other definitions. Damon Knight, famous science fiction author, says science fiction is what we point to when we say it. So a very practical kind of definition. If I point to Dune or Star Wars or RUR, then and say that that's science fiction, then that's what it is. Hugo Gernsback really is credited as the inventor of science fiction in the 20th century. That's an interesting story. What Gernsback was the owner of a shop that sold radios and other kind of technology, and he started science fiction sort of to advertise these, but he always focused his journals, the magazine he started, The Amazing Stories. He tried to focus them on stories that were about the technology to kind of increase sales of science fiction. He did not originally call it science fiction. He called it scientification. It's kind of hard to say, actually. And he says here, I mean the Jules Verne, H.G. Wells, and Edgar Allan Poe type of story, a charming romance intermingled with scientific fact and prophetic vision. Robert A. Heinlein, another famous science fiction author, says a handy short definition of almost all science fiction might read, realistic speculation about possible future events based solidly on adequate knowledge of the real world, past and present, and on a thorough understanding of the nature and significance of the scientific method. Heinlein was actually a conservative author, very militaristic, as you probably know from watching movies based on his stories if you haven't read any of his fiction. So again, here's someone who would not count as science fiction under the most critical analysis by Darko Suvin. Rod Sterling, who you might know from The Twilight Zone, says that fantasy is the impossible made probable, and science fiction is the improbable made possible. And then finally, Lester Del Rey says that even the devoted aficionado or fan has a hard time trying to explain what science fiction is. So here we have lots of disagreement about what science fiction is. So how do we come to some kind of understanding? Is it just left up to the individual? What are we going to do about that? There we have a scene from Star Wars. Here we have faster than light travel. We're going to see another example of that from Star Trek.
Warp speed. Warp 2. Warp 3. Here she goes. Warp 4. Warp 5. Warp 6. Warp 7. Warp 8. There. Heat shields at maximum. Warp 9. 9.2. 9.3. We need breakaway speed. 9.5. 9.6. 9.7. 9.8.
So what we had in those two clips are clips from what's considered the best movies in the individual series. So The Empire Strikes Back for Star Wars and the return or the search for, oh shoot, sorry, the voyage home from Star Trek. Why I showed these is because not only do they show faster than light travel, which we know fairly certainly is not possible according to science, so it's impossible, but also time travel, which seems improbable. We typically think of both of these series as science fiction, and yet they would not fit many ideas of what science fiction is. Space opera is particularly attacked for not being science fiction. It's a hacking, grinding, stinking, outworn spaceship yarn, or world-saving for that matter. We offer space opera. They have three characteristics: the spaceship, the yarn, and a formulaic plot. Now, whether you think Star Wars and Star Trek have formulaic plots might be open for debate. Many people do see them as mediocre. Certainly, Darko Suvin did, but they are based on space travel, right? That becomes an interesting question about, well, if it's based on space travel, why doesn't it count as science fiction? The Skylark of Space, 1928, is a written space opera, and it sounds like this. Thus time wore on, Perkins dead, Margaret unconscious, Dorothy lying in her seat, her thoughts a formless prayer, buoyed only by her faith in God and in her lover. Duquesne, self-possessed, smoking innumerable cigarettes, his keen mind at grips with its most desperate problem, grimly fighting until the very last instant of life, while the powerless spaceship fell with an appalling velocity and yet faster toward that cold and desolate monster of the heavens. Not very well written, but that might be one of the problems. Many people think that science fiction isn't well written fiction. Darko Suvin is not one of those people. He thinks that science fiction is some of the best literature, and when it's done correctly, it is the best literature, and it's based on cognitive estrangement. So representing the world to us in a way that makes it seem unfamiliar. That's the estranged part, and then reflecting on that reality and trying to handle it creatively and critically. So combining a belief in the potentialities of reason with methodical doubt in the most significant cases. Apologies for all the mess ups on this. I have to start over if I'm going to do that, and I don't want to put that time in it right now. I apologize about that. I'm already 10 minutes into it. So those are different ways of thinking about science fiction. And what we count as cognitive estrangement for Darko Suvin would be something like the movie Arrival.
Human. I'm human. What are you?
Oh my God. Louise, that's incredible. Are you getting this? Yes, sir. It's uploading back to base camp.
Human. Human.
In that clip, we have a sense of wonder. We have the novum, which is the alien language. So that circle-looking thing that the alien made, that is the language that the female scientist there tries to discover and understand throughout the rest of the movie. So there's something estranged there, how we communicate, and something cognitive. How does it help us to critique reality? If you haven't seen the movie, I won't give it away, but it is an excellent movie and certainly deserving of a nomination for an Academy Award. That takes us then back to why not space opera. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but for the most part, Suvin thinks that space opera is a fairy tale or a folk tale that treats the imagination as something of an end in itself and doesn't offer any really critical advantage for thinking about the world. So one way to think about that is to look at some clips from the movie. And so we're going to do that.
He's more machine rather than man, twisted and evil. Not as clumsy or random as a blaster. An elegant weapon for a more civilized age.
So in those two scenes, we have a critique of current reality. We have a critique of the machine more than man, similar to our critique that we saw in Dune, and similar to the critique that we see in one of the first real science fiction novels, I think, which is Frankenstein from 1818, and then a critique of blasters and guns as part of the technology that makes us less civilized. So my argument is that science fiction is not simply about reflecting the greatness of science, but also offers a critique of science. And so that's why I would say that something like Francis Bacon's New Atlantis is not really science fiction because it doesn't have a chance to criticize its own world. It's just a recognition of science as the domination of nature. And so post-Baconian science is using science merely for the domination of nature, which in the end is a domination of ourselves. Whereas something like Frankenstein has both a belief in science, but also a critique of that science. So I think that Suvin undermines himself by saying that things like Frankenstein and space operas are not science fiction because he misses out on the possible critiques that are embedded in those. And he doesn't really want to listen to critiques of science, in my opinion. So for me, what we're looking at is science, technology,